started, I'd just like to ask if the judges have any specific judging philosophy, and while we're at it, I'm going to list favorite colors starting on this side.
Not so much philosophy, just that you would be respectful to each other. That's going to be the thing that I'm going to be looking, one of the things I'm going to be looking for. Favorite color, green, for hope. Like, I hope this round goes well. Very cool.
Okay, I don't really have a favorite color. I can think of a reason why I like each of the colors.
That is
We'll
very
take
cool.
that one. I would just ask that you don't speak so fast that I can't comprehend what you're saying.
Okay.
Give me time to write it down.
All right.
Just pick blue because everybody picks blue as your favorite. I'm going to tell you that I think that probably the most important thing I'm going to listen to is the cross-examinations and the responses to those, because it's the one thing you have to do on the fly, and so that's where you're going to get extra points from me.
All right. And if everybody's ready. All right. And the negative team.
So, thank you.
Let's get started. Quote, as Russia seeks to challenge American control in virtually all corners of the world, Putin is determined to embrace Sudan, which he sees as an entryway into Africa. The president of Sudan's trip to Russia was a clear example of how the Russian president is displaying much more confidence in challenging the United States, not only in the Middle East, but also in Africa. End quote. In Sudan, Russia plays a prominent role in challenging U.S. goals in order to gain more power on the global scale. Because it is necessary to maintain successful interactions in Sudan and to prevent interfering countries from further damaging the United States' interests, Stephanie and I stand resolved. The United States should substantially reform its foreign policies regarding international terrorism. Now, before we get really muddied by the details of our case, I'd like to define two terms. The first term is international terrorism, and according to the U.S. Code, this means terrorism involving citizens or the territory of more than one country. The term terrorism means premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by groups or clandestine agents. And the second definition I'd like to present is state sponsor of terrorism, which can be labeled as SSOT from this point on. And this is defined as countries determined by the Secretary of State to have repeatedly provided support for acts of international terrorism. Now, with our key terms defined, let's move on to our thesis and goal for today's debate round. The United States' strategic goals in the Middle East and in Africa are being threatened by Russian influence. In Sudan, Russian influence jeopardizes U.S. security goals. Therefore, the goal for today's round is ensuring American strategic interests. Ensuring American strategic interests, which we can see the current system fails to do when we examine the facts of the current system. The first fact is simply that Sudan complies with the United States standards. Sudan complies with the United States standards. The U.S. Department of State spokesperson Heather Nauert announced that, quote, the United States has decided to recognize the government of Sudan's sustained positive action in 5 key areas. First, to maintain cessation of hostilities. Second, to improve humanitarian access across Sudan. Third, to end destabilizing activity in South Sudan. Fourth, to build and deepen U.S.-Sudan cooperation in countering terrorism. And fifth, improving regional security with a particular focus on countering the Lord's Resistance Army, end quote. Now, this is a longer piece of evidence, but essentially what it's talking about is the United States has 5 requirements for Sudan, and they fulfill all of them. Yet they still remain on the state-sponsored terror list. This brings us to the second fact. The United States has strategic interests for Sudan. The United States has strategic interests for Sudan. Ali Verger, a researcher and official who oversaw the implementation of the Sudanese peace agreement with South Sudan, stated that, quote, in addition to improving consultation with Sudanese outside of government, strengthening U.S. public communications, and addressing trade promotion, the U.S. has an opportunity to join up thinking and serve multiple U.S. interests. For example, in Yemen, it is Sudanese ground forces that are doing the fighting and dying in the service of the Saudi-led coalition. Securing Sudanese cooperation to continue to help de-escalate the conflict should not be overlooked, end quote. Sudan's forces combat ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist organizations, both in and out of Sudan. By confronting these threats, Sudan has become a key player in assisting America's security. But strained relations between the United States and Sudan may eventually end their assistance. unless the United States maintains strong ties with Sudan. But unfortunately, there is another country vying to take America's place. We can see this in fact 3. Russia is primed for control. Russia is primed for control. Researchers Dr. Theodore Karasik and Giorgio Caffieri said, quote, Khartoum sees Moscow as a partner that can help Sudan maintain its territorial integrity. Just as it helped Syria's embattled President Bashar al-Assad, such thinking is in line with the views of leaders of Arab states across the ideological spectrum. In the bigger picture, Russia aims to make itself invaluable to Arab countries, not only as an arms dealer, but as an indispensable mediator. End quote. Now, this brings us to the second harm. The state sponsor of terror designation strains U.S. relations. The state sponsor of terror designation on Sudan strains U.S. relations. Ali Verget explained that, quote, the United States continues to designate Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism, preventing a broader normalization of relations. Furthermore, Sudan's economic crisis has led to skepticism about the effectiveness of sanctions relief. End quote. Unless the United States removes the state sponsor of terror designation, Sudan cannot pursue debt relief or be open to foreign investment to assist its plummeting economy. The U.S. and Sudan's strained relations open the door for Russia, a much more viable option to Sudan. However, even in the early stages, we can see that Russia is determined to harm U.S. interests. We can see this in harm 2. Russian control compromises U.S. interests. Russian control compromises U.S. interests. Quote, the Wagner mercenaries, a Russian paramilitary organization, were sent to Sudan in a conflict against South Sudan to back up Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir's government militarily and hammer out beneficial conditions for the Russian companies, end quote. The U.S. and UN have struggled to balance the hostile relations between Sudan and South Sudan. There is currently peace in the region, but Moscow is striving to stir up conflict once again. Just one of the ways it poses a problem to the United States. America cannot stand still and watch as Russian influence increases throughout Sudan and Africa, attacking our goals and security interests. Fortunately, there is a solution to this problem, and that is the affirmative plan. And this is simply to remove Sudan from the state sponsor of terror designation. Sudan will be removed from the state sponsor of terror list so the country can pursue debt relief. In addition, it will open Sudan up to investment from businesses and banks around the world. Agency and enforcement, the President, Congress, and any other necessary bodies. Funding any costs will be paid for by normal budgetary means, and timeline, this plan will be implemented immediately after today's debate round. Now, let's talk about the advantages of passing the affirmative policy. And the advantage is simply this. You are advancing American security interests. Advancing American security interests. Quote, the normalization of Washington's relations with Sudan reflects the Trump administration's growing interest in working with Khartoum to combat terrorist threats and expand U.S. diplomatic heft in Africa as Russia vies for influence of its own. Proponents of mending ties say the sanctions and designations are harming average Sudanese citizens the most. They say the prospect of sanctions relief and lifting the terrorism sponsor designation represents the first opportunity in decades for the United States to compel Sudan to carry out meaningful reforms on human rights and negotiate peace with rebel groups. End quote. Removing the United States' outdated policy for Sudan means the United States will no longer harm its own strategic interests. Instead, it will be responsible for improving the lives of tens of thousands of people. When we support Sudan, we strengthen an ally fighting against terrorism. So I strongly urge you to both decrease harm to Sudan and the United States and advance American strategic